is the first intro video to a new series, the rest of which will not be filmed live. This one was filmed live, well, due to a series of complications, and because I did actually want to be able to take live questions from our attendees if they had any. Before I get started, I just want to remind everyone that we welcome all who welcome all, and that we are intolerant of intolerance. I also just realized that I am still wearing my mask around my neck from going out today, so I'm just going to take that off really quick because that's uncomfortable. Set that aside to get washed. Anyway, if you're not new to our channel, then you know that one of the things that we create is historical content, where we go into the history of various pagan and occult things, various spiritual traditions, and that we tend to do so from a globalist perspective. For those of you who don't know what a globalist perspective is, let me give you a very blunt example that actually originates from Tumblr, of all places. But it would not be inaccurate in history to have an adventure story set in Mesoamerica that had a samurai and a Jewish person and a Romani person and, you know, a Mesoamerican warrior and a conquistador all go on an adventure together. Because all of those people were in Mexico.
Could plausibly have been in Mexico at that time.
At that time. A globalist perspective is one that teaches how much everything was happening at once.
Right. There's a joke about how all time is actually happening at once, and we're not getting into that right now. But the fact of the matter is,
although quantum physics is magic, and we encourage the pursuit of the knowledge thereof. Please continue.
But the way that history is taught, particularly in America, is that we teach mostly American history, and then we go back and teach European history. And then maybe, like in college, you'll get classes on Asian history or on Latin American history or whatever. But it's all very segregated by region, and this results in this idea that Rome was an incredibly long time ago. Egypt was even longer ago than that, and somewhere after Rome but before America, you had a bunch of empires in Latin America, and that's sort of as close as they get to overlapping.
My favorite model of this is we have no explanation for how knowledge got around the world, and so we're going to say that instead of having any kind of trade routes or exploration happening before we understand that it could have happened, it must be aliens. Because a lack of a globalist model leads to the assumption
that it was aliens.
You know, that plus racism and white supremacy and a colonialist mentality.
Right. The fact of the matter is that history happened everywhere at once. We can talk some other time about which pieces of it are happening at the same time, but but the same year happened everywhere at the same time, and it turns out lots of stuff happens in different parts of the world in any given year.
And something like a volcano can affect multiple countries, multiple cultures at once, and did several times in history.
That we know of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Something like a minor ice age might affect multiple countries at once, multiple cultures at once, influence the cultures, and then they would intertangle again and influence each other again. This is a globalist model of history, and it's the one that Sanctum teaches all of our classes from, as best we can. We try to leave our bias out of things, keeping in mind that bias is inherent, and there's always going to be some that affects any research that you're doing. Which leads me to why this intro to this course is a little strange. So I sat down recently with several private students, ones who pay for my tutoring independently of anything going on with Sanctum. Um, as in, they are paying me, not the organization of Sanctum. And I have several students that learn beginner herbalism, intermediate herbalism, advanced herbalism. But in particular, this is with beginner herbalism students. And I started going through the history of herbalism. And as I did so, I did what my teachers did for me and detailed, hey, there's a huge bias in the history of herbalism. If you start looking into the history of it, there's a huge bias. And a lot of the research is really dominated by this one branch, and then there are these two other branches that get some acknowledgement in the Western field, but generally via appropriation, rather than any thorough understanding of them or their history. And then there's these huge blanks until sort of when the new eclectics started traveling everywhere and sort of taking things from them in the 1800s. But we have this huge bias. And then I was like, okay, well, rather than teaching from this bias, I want to try and create a better history of herbalism. And I want to be clear that I'm not overstating things when I say that I've read more than 40 books for this series, that I've downloaded so many articles and read through them, so many. I've actually lost count, trying to flesh out my understanding of the history of herbalism. And I just kind of want to do an intro that's mostly a rant. And I kind of apologize, it's not going to be a very professional one, because I'm just so frustrated. I'm so frustrated. So rather than tell you what I'm going to do, I'm going to actually just start. The history of herbalism is, of course, 50,000+ years old. And we're starting to understand a lot about prehistorical herbalism from the study of sites that we found where prehistoric humans lived, from the study of near human relatives, so like the bonobos, yes, and polypores, and from the study of human remains. We can look at the diseases that a person had and how they survived it. We can look at dente, and see what they were eating. Sometimes we can look at what remains of their stomach to show what they might have been ingesting, and we can sort of get a picture, not a complete one by any means, of prehistory. And then, like a lot of historical research, the history of herbalism tends to jump. We have sort of this prehistorical model, and then we jump, and we're in the near Middle East. Sumer, Assyria, Akkad, eventually Babylon, Persia. We then move from that into Egyptian history. From Egyptian history, we move into Greco-Roman history. From Greco-Roman history, we move into Christianization of Rome. From the Christianization of Rome, we move into the Roman expansion through what they labeled the pagan areas. So we're talking, the Romanization of the Germanics, the Christianization of the Germanics, and blending into their medicine. Then we have, going over into the Americas, colonial medicine. From colonial medicine, we move into the new eclectics. And it's at the new eclectics that there starts to be an understanding of how impressive First Nations medicine is. Now, that understanding is, of course, via cultural appropriation, where they were just taking this knowledge. Then we have the formation of the American Medical Association, the stripping away of the right to education from Black people, from women, from First Nations people, the tamping down of this pursuit of understanding First Nations medicine. And then that moves into the 60s and 70s, and we see a sudden interest in Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine.
Right, I was going to say, but wait, we left out like whole continents and subcontinents that had
Didn't
their
we,
own
though?
systems of herbalism for thousands of years.
We did.
What was happening then?
And during the 60s and 70s, everyone was like, oh my gosh, look at these other systems of medicine. Let's take yoga and turn it into something it totally isn't. Remind me one of these days to do a class that is just everything that your yoga class taught you that is not part of yoga.
Do you really have to play that music?
You know,
That's another
but
story.
you
Never
get
mind.
these Western
Anyway.
herbalists not just taking the First Nation stuff that was appropriated originally by the New Eclectics, but now taking from traditional Chinese medicine, now taking from Ayurveda, now taking from...
Without the relevant cultural context, by the way.
Yeah, and you get modern herbalism, which is a mishmash of the model of the four humors. We're still, like, we say we're not basing things in it, but I'll get into it more as the class advances. We really still are. Just the same way that even though a lot of the Hippocratic method has been proven not to work, the American medical system is still based in the Hippocratic corpus. Not the point of today's class. One of these days I'll do the history of medicine, and it will be gory, and it will be long, and it will be detailed, but it is not this day. But the history of herbal medicine, we still have this bias, and all we've done is taken a few things, sans context, injected them into the Western model, and then presented that as a complete model. And it isn't. It isn't, it isn't, it isn't. And I really wanted the class that I was going to be doing to fill in some of the gaps. And I've been trying for months to get this done. I've read so many books. I've read so many articles. And I will say I fleshed it out somewhat. It turns out that we can understand a lot of what prehistoric man did by studying the few Stone Age societies that still exist now. But of course that's a risk, because interacting with a Stone Age society...
Right, there's an intrinsic contamination risk.
On multiple levels. Cultural contamination, literal pathological contamination will kill them.
They'll kill us in at least one case.
Yeah, but he totally deserved it.
He had it coming.
He had it coming. He had it coming. He only had himself to blame.
Blame.
Anyway, not the point. Kind of the point. Because the world is big, alright? I know that with the advent of the internet and how easy it is to get a hold of information, it can seem very small. But there are so many more cultures in it than people acknowledge. This is something I've already ranted about in previous videos, how much it drives me up the wall when they say, in Africa.
Africa's
as if
enormous.
It's not a continent that could just swallow all these other countries. Or when they say, you know, Mesoamerica, and it's like, okay, which part? Because that's a lot. Or when they assume that Peru was part of Mesoamerica, because it wasn't. Or when they say, you know, the Native Americans did this. Okay, but which Native Americans? Because there are hundreds of cultures, thousands of offshoots, so many languages. We're talking about the Americas, which are continents, and all the people they're on throughout all history before the colonizers, and we're just summing that up as the Native Americans did this thing. When I'm doing the research to try and flesh out from this non-Western perspective, I am running into that bias in everything I'm reading, even the book that claimed it was not going to have it.
Yeah.
The intro was all about how it was going to go into all these other cultures and the history thereof. And I'm not going to deny that there were a few chunks that I learned something from. But predominantly, it focused on a comparison between the medicine workers of the Germanic tribes compared to traditional Chinese medicine. And sort of compare contrast tea ceremonies and... Anyway, I have even skirted the bounds of legality using, Sci-Hub and Library Genesis to get around some paywalls. Um, I've asked Ian for a alumni library card so I can
Right.
have access to this one particular college library. I'm really trying to flesh this history out. And basically, my intro is the rant about running into a wall of the idea that there's this one route through history that matters and nothing else does.
Can I
Please.
nutshell a little bit on something? Look, any system of medicine, not just herbal medicine, exists within a cultural context. If you look at modern American medicine, that exists within the cultural context of modern America. Let's be clear, the treatments that are used would not be the treatments that were used with the knowledge base that exists without the culture that exists. In particular, I can think of dozens of people I know personally who would get different treatment if the insurance model was different. So, any system of medicine as practiced and as recorded occurs within cultural context. Therefore, any history of a system of medicine must take into account the cultural context which that system of medicine exists within. The problem is, everyone comes from their own cultural context, and everyone writing a history of any given system of medicine is writing through the lens of their own cultural context, which means that you get very few accounts of any system of medicine from a different culture. And the ones that you do get are stunningly biased.
How often racist? I mean, we talk about bias. Not all bias is necessarily racist. Sometimes it's sexist, sometimes it's just.
A different point of view. No, some of them are also racist as hell.
Yeah.
What this means is that trying to conduct a globalist overview of the history of herbalism is difficult, partially because you had many systems of herbal medicine that evolved in parallel, and partially because saying they evolved in parallel is a dirty, dirty lie. Because the fact of the matter is cross-cultural trade existed, and one of the things that was traded was medicine.
But that's something that it's very hard to get acknowledged in some fields where we're just not talking about the fact that, Christopher Columbus didn't, in fact, discover North America
Right.
or ever set foot on it. We're not talking about the trade routes that existed before the European trade routes.
Or even the trade routes that existed within Europe, including the spice route.
Yeah. And
connected to Europe anyway.
it's just been massively frustrating. And part of the reason, so of course I know that this history exists because it has to.
Right, it
has to. They existed, therefore they have a history. But also because I've come across it in other areas. So some of you are familiar with our series on entheogens and how we go into the history of the use of various entheogens. And generally that history of the use of entheogens talks about their use in India or in Mesoamerican cultures, in the case of psilocybin, and the way that we know about that from historical remains, from examining sacred sites, from talking to the cultures that still exist, because some of them, I hate to break it to you, are actually still around and you can just ask them things. But okay, cultural anthropology and history don't always get along. But I digress. I know that we know certain things from those research projects. I know that with psilocybin we found the mushroom temples and the Prince of Flowers, and evidence of psychogenic mushroom use all around the globe because that was documented by people who were researching the history of psilocybin. There is no way that psilocybin is the only herb. Well, it's not even an herb.
Botanical.
That's botanical, thank you. That's for a different class, the distinction between an herb, a spice, and a botanical, and a fungi. Not the point. There's no way that's the only thing that was being used by those cultures at that time. So why don't we know the rest? And maybe it's my own fault and it's a lack in my research. Maybe it's the fault of a system that puts valuable information behind expensive paywalls. And unless you can afford to just keep on taking on hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt, then you just don't get to keep learning. Or maybe it's that we have a blind spot in our historical research and a significant bias, at least in Western culture, as to what we think matters in the history of herbalism and what we don't.
Well, okay, so I propose a hypothesis.
Okay.
Which is that most cultures primarily care about their own history.
Yeah. So you're saying that if I spoke the language and I traveled...
I'm saying that if you were to travel to, for example, get permission to view the archives of the imperial court in China and could read the ancient Chinese dialects, then you would find a documented history of traditional Chinese herbal medicine there.
Which I have some of from other people's research that way.
Right.
It's Africa and South America, Australia.
So the problem with doing the reason that one, you're going to have incomplete records from the societies that have written record, just because there hasn't been a great deal of translation done, and there hasn't been a ton of research done because of that bias I just mentioned. Two, okay.
We killed a bunch of them, and now they don't want to talk to us?
There has been such a number done on basically every society in Africa, basically every society in South America and Mesoamerica by colonizers, that a lot of history has been suppressed or destroyed. And a lot of what's left, you have to go and ask very nicely in a way that convinces them that you're not doing damage to the knowledge or with the knowledge.
And it's my experience that white academics may mean very, very well. And still do harm.
Right. So, getting the information may still exist within cultural memory, but getting access to that cultural memory as an outsider is a tall order. And getting access to that cultural memory with permission to share it, and sharing it in a coherent form as an outsider, is even more of a tall order. And that means that as far as this class goes, we are not able to present a complete globalist perspective.
And it's just
we
been
just
devastating
don't have
for
access
me.
to the information.
I can't even tell you. You can ask Ian. I've been waking up in the middle of the night, as I often do, and I'm just reading, trying to find more information to put into this course, more information to put into the booklet that will eventually go out to our patrons.
It's going to be a book. She's saying booklet, it's going to be a book.
Well, the timeline's going to be a booklet.
Oh, okay, sorry.
And it's just been devastating to me. The bias, the way that they assume that they're presenting a complete history, even though there's absolutely no possible way that they are. I've spent a non-trivial amount buying other people's books on the topic, and I'm disappointed. And I want to do better by my students, and I'm not sure how much better I'm going to be able to be other than just being honest about it. That there is this huge bias, that the research is dominated by one perspective, and that as much as I am trying to flesh it out, there are huge swaths of the timeline and of various very important cultures. I mean, is there an unimportant culture? But significant to the timeline of the world. Again, is there an insignificant culture? Butterfly flapping its wings.
Right.
I digress again. This intro is to explain that this course is going to be incomplete. That it was either continue researching and never present anything, or accept that I was going to present an incomplete history, be as upfront and honest about it as I could be, and then continue researching in the hopes of someday being able to present something better. Because I'm not ever going to be done looking into this. For one thing, I don't believe that an herbalist is ever done learning about herbalism. I don't believe that we can ever assume that we know everything we need to know and we're just done learning now. I don't believe that we can assume that only the knowledge of the future is valuable and everything from the past is not. So I will continue researching this, and as I learn new information, I hope to continue presenting it to our students. But I wanted to be upfront that there is this huge bias, that there's this one timeline that is very well documented, and everything that doesn't align with that is obscured, buried, dismissed, omitted, ignored, altered. Seen some of that too.
Yeah.
There is a bias in academia that will keep being an issue in our courses.
But in this particular case, it's egregious.
It's egregious. As always, all of my sources will be documented and available upon request as we move forward into the series. And I really encourage you, please correct me. If I'm speaking about your culture as I present this history, and I'm basing it off the research that I've done, these books I've read, these articles I've read, these translations I've read. If you are a
member of a culture, you absolutely have the right to correct us, who are doing, at best, secondary research based off of primary sources. At worst, we're doing tertiary or quaternary research based on secondary or tertiary sources. So please, if you are a member of a culture or tradition, feel free to correct us. If you are not a member of a culture or tradition,
please feel free to point us at better research.
Please feel free to point us at better sources.
Yes.
Having said that, we're going to pick up with probably a pre-recorded class with the beginning of this history as we currently have it documented next time.
All right.
Oh gosh, not so long ago the history book said my Native American tribe was extinct. So yeah, the mainstream books aren't completely right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the. But I'm standing here telling you that I exist.
I come from a culture that has a lot of lies told about it in history books. Sorry about that. All the sympathy, all the deepest sympathy. Okay. Before I cut for the night, does anyone have any questions about the structure of the class moving forward? Right. Or about what we're going to be covering?
You tuned into the live stream, which means congratulations, you get a chance to ask questions live.
Yeah. All the other classes are going to be pre-recorded, mostly so that I can put subtitles for the things I will inevitably mispronounce.
And also because it's just much easier to record when certain incredibly loud young ones are not in the house.
I don't have a teenager in the house. What?
Moving on. Anybody?
Questions, comments, concerns, snarky repartee? We'll give it a couple minutes. So the first part is just going to be a timeline. And I know that timelines are boring, but I want to go into just the outline. And then we're going to go back and address certain significant moments on that. So we got a question regarding white sage, which is really more for an Ask a Witch class. So I will just say the easiest way to do no harm is to purchase something from the culture that it came from and to have them instruct you on its appropriate use so that you don't do harm accidentally. And that's for anything, whether that's Palo Santo, frankincense, white sage. If you're concerned with doing harm, purchase it from the people that grow it, that
from
make
someone
it,
that it belongs to.
And have them teach you how to use it, and have them teach you where the boundaries are. Okay.
That was the only question we've gotten so far.
And I'm really happy to see that someone says timelines as a broad overview are super interesting because I find them fascinating, but I keep having people being like, it's so boring, and I'm like, timelines, especially ones that really show you where it's happening all over the world at once. Globalist perspective. Okay. All right, well then if no one has any other questions, over the next week, we will have our first one up, which will be on prehistory, pre-written history, and what we do know and what is documentable and provable.
And then what we can infer from that.
Exactly. Well said. Be safe out there, everyone, and take herbalism books and history books with a massive grain of salt, and remember that learning is never done.